Content warning. This video discusses xenophobia, racism, anti-Semitism, people being violated, fascism, nuclear war, religious extremism, and stupid podcasters. Viewer discretion is advised. In the past year, we bore witness to a fascinating phenomenon. When Trump was sworn into the Oval Office, his supporters reacted with jubilant applause. Yet, when he started making good on many of the things he promised to do, such as allowing Doge to run roughshod on government agencies or enacting mass deportations, large portions of his base started to change their tune. In many, this prompted the natural reaction of, "Why are you surprised? Trump ran on these policies. Yet you only figured out that he was going to do this now?" Many of my fellow leftists derided these people for thinking that this might turn out any differently from his first term. They wondered why so many Americans who voted against him in 2020 voted for him in 2024. Some have even concluded that these ex-Trump supporters must have been lying about being unable to see the writing on the wall, having concluded that there is no way that they couldn't have anticipated his abominable conduct. However, I do think there is an explanation to why so many of his voters didn't realize what Trump was going to do. Not one that makes their behavior rational, because quite frankly, voting for someone like Trump is never rational, but one that makes their behavior understandable, though not justifiable. The first thing you need to know in order to understand MAGA regret is the way in which the Republican Party advertised their policies, because they were marketed in a fundamentally dishonest way. A good way to understand this is by looking at the way Republicans tried to sell mass deportations. They didn't phrase it as, "We want to keep this nation racially pure." They instead said, "The nation is being invaded by violent, drug-dealing turbo-rapists, and if you vote for us, we'll get rid of them." The policy was marketed not as an attempt at ethnic cleansing, but rather as an initiative to protect the country from violent criminals. Due to this marketing campaign, when a lot of Trump supporters saw ICE terrorizing normal civilians, they thought, "You promised that you'd get rid of turbo-rapists. They're not turbo-rapists. What gives?" When conservatives try to convince you to vote against a minority group, they will often refrain from targeting that group directly, and instead will target a bad behavior associated with that group. So Republicans will often talk about gangsters instead of black people, welfare leeches instead of immigrants, and international finance instead of Jews. This increases the likelihood that someone who knows and cares for a member of a marginalized community will vote for aggressive policies, because instead of thinking, "That Republican's going to go after my friend Jamal for being black," they'll think, "They're only going to go after gangsters. Jamal's not a gangster, so he'll be safe." That's one major factor that serves to explain why Trump's base of support was so blindsided. But it would be reductive to boil it down to just that, because there is still the elephant in the room: Project 2025. For the few of you living under a rock, Project 2025 is a plan that was cooked up by the Heritage Foundation that outlined what the Republican Party sought to achieve through the opportunity provided by Trump's second presidency. The plan sought to essentially create mass layoffs to remove anyone not loyal to right-wing causes, and make it so that every employee has to be loyal to the US president, lest they lose their job. From there, they would use their complete control over the US policy to achieve various ghoulish political goals. If you want to learn more about this topic, I recommend that you watch this video by John Oliver. The fact that these goals were outlined so heavily in advance led many to wonder why many Trump supporters didn't pay attention to what was in the document. The answer is actually rather simple. Trump lied and said he didn't have anything to do with the doc, and right-wing media, like Fox News, followed his lead. This caused a lot of Republican voters to think that the fear over Project 2025 was nothing more than trumped-up hysteria to frame the president as a monster he wasn't. Speaking of right-wing media, I think it's time that we discuss the influence of podcasters, in part because they have been given a lot of credit for determining the outcome of Trump's 2024 campaign. Two videos that I have found to be quite illuminating on the subject are Khadija Mbo's "Make Conservatives Cool Again" and Jason Pargin's Why Are Young People Moving to the Right? The videos point out that a major appeal of these podcasts is that they come off as a space where you can have a fun time, rather than a place where you discuss weighty affairs. This means that, to a lot of folk, these podcasts feel like more of an entry-level space, as opposed to your local newspaper, which you might find uses a lot of unfamiliar terminology, or might expect a familiarity with politics that the reader often lacks. It is also important to understand the particular mindset that the average listener of these podcasts tends to possess. They tend to have the attitude that if making critical statements about a community gets you flack, that must mean that the community has all the power. Now, this attitude is fallacious, because whatever your opinion is, it will get flack from somewhere, because every opinion has someone who disagrees with it. But that is nonetheless how they view it. This, to a major degree, makes it easy for a lot of vaguely right-leaning folk to overestimate the amount of power that lefties have, so you'll often find them treating someone not liking an edgy joke they made as a portent of the end times. This is important to remember, because Trump's statements, whilst horrible, draw a lot of flack. And because of this, a lot of people saw Trump's rude behavior as proof that he was fighting the power. They also have the attitude that media that platforms both sides is more honest, more trustworthy. Now, this isn't inherently the case, since that just results in you being exposed to multiple biases instead of one. But that is nonetheless what they believe, and we'll have to keep that in mind during our analysis. The reason why they hold this view isn't super intuitive to those who are knowledgeable on political matters, so I'd like you to participate in a thought experiment to help you understand their thought process a bit better. Let's imagine that you are teleported to an alien planet, and that planet is full of incredibly contentious political debates that are about completely different subjects than Earth politics, meaning that your personal experience doesn't tell you who's right either way. Let's imagine that the sides of every debate have a hard time agreeing on basic facts, and often accuse each other of serious allegations whilst denying that their own side has done any wrongdoing. In that environment, it's easy to wonder if an outlet supporting a particular side of the debate is voicing its support because of the evidence, or just because of political bias. In this environment, sources that claim to let both sides speak seem more trustworthy, because they don't feel like they are there to convince you either way. It feels like that issue isn't present, even though it's not like either side will become unable to be dishonest just because their opponent is also platformed by the outlet. That's why so many folk feel these spaces are trustworthy, because they see them as a shortcut through the chaos and confusion of a political landscape in which no one agrees on anything. They see podcasts that platform both sides as a place with no bias, rather than one with multiple opposing biases. These podcasts' habit of platforming both sides is also important, because of what it tells us about these shows and their audience. Namely, while they certainly lean right, they aren't fanatic loyalists to the Republican Party either. You can see this in Andrew Schultz saying that Trump is doing the opposite of what they voted for, or Joe Rogan comparing ICE to the Gestapo. These people are still incredibly problematic. Rogan, for example, falsely claimed that schools handed out litter boxes to students who identified as cats, but they are not ride-or-die Republicans. I should note that their claim that they platform both sides isn't entirely false either. Rogan has invited Kyle Kulinski and Bernie Sanders onto his podcast, even endorsing the latter in the 2020 election. Theo Vaughn invited Hassan Piker and Sanders onto his podcast. This does not undo the harm they do, because to quote a video on Max Headroom, worshipping all gods does not make you an atheist, it makes you a polytheist. But it does demonstrate that they are not as fanatically loyal to the party line as many people think. This proves that Trump's base, like most political movements, is to a large extent composed of casual supporters, who backed him less because they were incredibly enthusiastic about him as a person, and more because he would benefit them somehow, maybe by fighting inflation or getting rid of political corruption. When these promises inevitably went unfulfilled, it resulted in a mass outcry amongst a significant portion of his base. Individuals like this are prevalent in every right-wing movement, and you have to understand that if you want to make significant headway against them. These individuals are the easiest to sway away from right-wing political movements, due to their lack of loyalty and incredibly conditional support. Reaching out to these casuals can be a rather effective way to starve right-wing lunatics of the numbers needed to do anything of note. The Republican Party must be stopped for the sake of not only America, but humanity at large. Many people within the party believe in bringing about the end of the world because it will start the rapture. That kind of person cannot be trusted with nuclear weapons. We must stop them from being able to hold office, and so we must hit them where they are weak. We must target the parts of the base who are the most swayable, to deprive them of their support. And speaking of swayability, let's move on to the next point. Many of you are probably wondering how so many people who voted for Trump in 2024 didn't look at his track record in his previous term to figure out that he was a liar. The answer is depressingly simple. People have short memories. If you're well versed in politics, it's easy to forget that most people do not pay much attention to the news. They tend to operate off of vibes in the heat of the moment, instead of a consistent political ideology. And because of that, they pay little attention to the situation on the ground. They are quick to forget what things were like even a few years ago. George Bush Jr. had abysmal approval ratings when he left office. Nowadays, he's thought up pretty highly. Why did this happen? Because people only pay attention to what's occurring in the present, and rarely look back on the past or consider the future. Part of this is down to the common attitude that you shouldn't allow political disagreements to destroy the bonds you have with other people. This line of thought is common because most disputes are of little importance, and so they should not be friendship-ruining. Politics, however, is not most disputes. It determines which laws we must follow, which actions we must take, and which lives we may lead. The fact that we as a society often treat political disagreements the same way we would a sports game has led many to think of the choice of which politician to vote for as a purely personal decision that is of little consequence. It is not, and the proliferation of this line of thinking discourages people from considering the wider ramifications of their votes. People voted for Trump, in part, because we trained people not to see the warning signs, because we trained them to see people being afraid of the wrong political party gaining power as being the same as fearing the wrong sports team winning a game. We need to remind people of this, because it's important to remember that a significant portion of the basis of right-wing parties tend to be people who lack much awareness of the political climate. If you meet one of these individuals, and you find that they aren't super into politics, then it might be worth giving them info on what's happening at the ground level. You're likely going to find that, at least some of the time, people like that will show a willingness to stray from conservative dogma, and choose to quit being a mark for right-wing politicians. And, on the subject of knowing very little, let's have a discussion about Trump saying he'll fight the establishment whilst also being a member of the 1%. To begin to understand how so many people thought Trump wasn't part of the establishment, we first need to understand how Trump supporters think of the establishment. When Trump supporters say elites, they aren't using the word as an umbrella term for anyone who has some level of power. Rather, they are using it to refer to a shadowy cabal that is secretly controlling the world from the shadows. Due to this, when they see Trump feuding with a billionaire, his base won't think of it as one establishment vulture feuding with another, but instead as proof that Trump is anti-establishment. This is because the billionaire would belong to the establishment, and thanks to their establishment as unified cabal mindset, they see anyone disliked by one facet of the establishment as opposing the whole of the establishment. There's a video from the channel LonerBox on this topic called Trump, a Corporate-Sponsored Rebellion, which raises some good points, even if I'm not the biggest fan of the man who made it. The video argues that rebellion, for many, functions more as an aesthetic or attitude, as opposed to a force of meaningful change. This, combined with the aforementioned mindset of a monolithic establishment, interact in a unique manner. You see, Trump is very wealthy, but he's a specific kind of wealthy. As Loner points out in his video, people see the 1% as the folk in charge of the highest echelons of power, and while Trump has historically been very wealthy, he didn't work in what is seen as an establishment market. His money was made through real estate and media appearances, which, while profitable, weren't exactly the kind of income streams that people think of when you ask people who control the world. People rarely respond to that question by claiming that it's realtors. Trump has always been a very wealthy man, but up until relatively recently, he was a small fry compared to the folk at the top of the totem pole. This allowed Trump to position himself as an underdog. His antics that caused him to get hate from a lot of people allowed him to spin himself as though he was the victim of an establishment smear job, as opposed to a guy who acted like a dickhead and received an appropriate amount of respect for it. When combined with a view of rebellion as an attitude instead of a source of change, this resulted in many Trump voters perceiving voting for him as the ultimate fuck you to the establishment, and not as them replacing one rich guy with another. What I think this ultimately demonstrates is that many of Trump's supporters are driven more by a frustration with the state of late-stage capitalism than active love for him and his policies. This cohort of his base is the most amenable to efforts to switch their allegiances, and, luckily for us, that might not be too hard. We too offer the working people of the world a change in the status quo. But unlike the right, we can actually keep our promises. As we speak, we are already seeing politicians like Zoran Mamdani change lives. The right's fake populism might be an awful disease, but thankfully, we are already seeing people distribute the cure.